Hello everyone, welcome in. This is section 2.4, draw hair and clothes that match your character's personality and tone, and Chyan's Coloso class, drawing and coloring anime style characters. So welcome in guys. If you guys want to make sure you're keeping on top of further class review updates, you can always subscribe and then you will be notified as well if you ring the bell or whatever the hell with the notification stuff. Or you can just follow along on the playlist as well for any class updates whenever you're looking for them. So section 2.4 really was just about as much as the title says, which was literally over hair and then clothing. So this is mainly going to be a two-part class review, so you can stick around to where you need. This involved a lot of first-handed experience and tips from Chyan, so some really valuable stuff to sort of keep in mind as you work through these elements of your illustration. So starting with hair, while studying theory is valuable, practicing on your own is what's important. So if there needs to be more time spent in precise practice, it's better to spend more time in each drawing and apply what's been learned accurately. This is more so just like a general tip, so it really should be separated, but in any case, I thought it was appropriate for hair as well, because it's really important that you kind of take your time and be deliberate with your decisions when drawing hair for your characters. Hair and clothing can tell a character's personality, setting, or overall atmosphere, both directly and indirectly. Because of that, deformers or stylistic choices can be applied to both. So Chyan kind of goes over an example of this being like an office lady, like if she has like scrounged up hair or like pulled back clean ponytail look, each of them will kind of show a different side to the character's personality. So clothing and hairstyles will have a big element to how your character is portrayed. When dividing hair, think of the big parts and small parts separately, which will affect things like irregularity, which he actually talks about being a good thing because you don't want hair to be too perfect, otherwise it'll look a little strange and unnatural for the character. And irregular elements help ground the hair to be more three-dimensional and aesthetic, so in this case, asymmetry is actually going to be your friend. So the big parts of the hair are going to be the front, the side, and the back parts of the hair. I mentioned this in, I think, 2.2 or 2.1. We were going over figure drawing, but sides are pretty much going to cover the ends of the bangs to the sideburns, and then the back is going to pretty much cover the rest. The front can be divided into the part between the eyes and the parts on either side, but it's important to make them narrow by comparison. So you could separate them further if you wanted to. I don't really feel like there's a need. This is already creating sectors of hair and making it a lot more easy to break down, and I don't really feel like there's a need to go further. But if you need, or if you have a very detailed character in the front section of the hair, that is an important tool that you can use as well. There's a part of the hair above the ear and behind the side part that has a different flow than the rest of the hair, and that's because it naturally has to deal with the ear being right next to it. So it either moves on top of the ear, gets pushed behind the ear, but in any case it's going to have a flow different than the rest of the hair because it has anatomy that it has to deal with around it besides just the skull. And then some more tips in general: divide irregularly in order to make hair more natural, and stick a small part of hair to a big part. If you're drawing things like bangs or flowing parts, it'll make it a lot easier to avoid weird or awkward shapes within the hair. Be aware of where the hair flows are in the strand, especially if you're drawing hair in conditions that demonstrate the change in it. So a good example of this is hair that blows in the wind. So generally hair actually has hair flows within each strand, and when hair is blowing, you'll actually see the hair pivot around those points. So it's important to note those when you're drawing their shape, so that way you can accurately demonstrate the strands of the hair or the big parts of the hair that you draw accurately depending on the context of the figure. And actually adding hair strands to where the flow of the hair changes will look most natural because it naturally splits there anyways. When hair is divided into smaller parts, the hair will look more mature, and vice versa. That's why chibi characters are generally drawn with very simplified hair. So if you want a cute or less mature character, a childish character, you can draw with less detail on the hair and group it into bigger parts. Hair is drawn in perspective to the head, so understanding the curves of the hair is important. Chyan really talks about the mop on the head. If you were to just drop a mop on someone's head, you'll notice that it kind of dangles around the side of the skull. In the same way, when we draw our figures and their hair, it's really important to note that the hair falls alongside the skull and doesn't sit necessarily on top of it, which will help give it more volume. And then this tip is actually for side profiles, but the side hair and the sideburns tends to stick out to the left a little bit. So when you're drawing, especially a side profile, if you draw it straight down, it's going to look a little awkward, or it's going to look like it's being pulled back. So make sure that side hair on a side profile is really pushing forwards and sticking out to the left. Common patterns for hair are going to be a side hair in an M shape. I'll show some examples of that on the screen for the rest of these as well. The next one would be where the front hair sticks out from the side hair. This is generally for energetic characters. Side parts going inwards, and hair antenna, also what's known as ahoge hair. You see this a lot in protagonists, almost comedically the Danganronpa protagonists as well. You'll see most of the main characters rocking those as well. And they're a really good example of what it really looks like and to what degree you can really emphasize it. Keep in mind you do want irregularity, but if the hair length is too random, it'll look awkward and misshapen. So make sure that even though the hair does have irregularity, it does have a form at the end of it. Hair is dimensional to the head, as mentioned with the mop example, and in the wind, hair closest to the head moves the least and moves the most at the ends, but in order to maintain dimension and show volume, flipping the hair over is a generally recommended tip, so you can think like a ribbon for that example. This is mainly broken down into two parts, so for drawing hair in the wind, keep in mind that the hair closest to the base of the skull is barely going to move, and it's actually going to act as a plant for the hair strands at the end, which you can draw to be a lot more flowy, and you can actually show their dimension a lot better if you're showing things like flips and turns with the hair, and that's where the ribbon example comes in. So if you draw a lot of ribbons, it can be a really good practice for drawing sort of that flipping motion with the hair. When you're drawing waves and curls of hair, especially in windy situations, they operate the same way as drawing parts. So same tips of everything up here applies, except for when the hair is clustered like a ponytail, because the hair actually loses dimension and it regains it as it splits again. So you can kind of think of this as the ponytail at the base of the band. That hair is grouped together and most of it isn't going to easily budge out, and so that's why the hair loses dimension and loses a lot of the irregularity you can really plant in it. And then at the end of the ponytail, when the hair starts splitting again and becomes more loose, you can have a little bit more volume to show for it. Moving on from the ponytail, make sure to draw the hair flowing outwards to show volume and that the silhouette has irregularity. And when the hair is shorter, it's important to show layers since hair becomes more visible at shorter lengths. So Chyan kind of goes over this with a male character drawing of hair, and he shows that in order to compensate for the less detail that he has to work with, since the hair is naturally shorter, he creates more layers in order to compensate for that. And then some more small tips as well. Give yourself feedback as you work through the drawing processes, making sure that you're double checking everything, making sure it looks okay before you move on to the next thing. Generally only draw one flip in hair for each strand. So if you're drawing hair in the wind like a ribbon and you have too many curls, it's gonna look more like curly hair itself, which is a hairstyle, but it's not necessarily one that looks natural in wind, so keep that in mind. And then consider the mood when adding the amount of hair strands wanted. He kind of goes over how stereotypically a lot of hair strands seen on characters makes them look sleepy, tired, or exhausted or stressed. So the small details when adding to hair will actually change the impression you get. Very, very important. The hair is very subtle when drawing it on figures. So that's it for hair. Let's dive into clothing. When drawing creases, draw with dimensions, and here are the rules for drawing creases. So you want to find the center of gravity, the part where the clothes are hanging from, and folds will generally occur at those points. Some good examples: the shoulder, elbow, and wrist for the arm. So if you're holding your arm up straight, a lot of the main points that are going to stick out the most are going to be from the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder. So you can keep those in mind as go-to points for drawing folds and creases for characters. Next, you want to consider the direction of the force, which is created by the anatomy, what's under the clothes, and where it's taking the material. And then finally, you want to know the shape of the creases, which is usually going to be Y or X shapes. So you can actually check this in photographic references, and Chyan kind of goes over this later in the lecture, but almost all creases are formed through Y or X shapes, so it makes it really easy to study them and practice them for yourself, seen on other photographic references as well. Creases have a distinct pattern, as mentioned, so focus on the important parts to mainly create the impression of the folding of the clothes and its material. Again, creases are generally drawn around joints, so shoulder, elbow, wrist, but also things like the chest, hips, knees, etc., etc. Loose clothes will generally have more vertical creases than horizontal creases, and vice versa for fitting clothes. So really what this means is for loose clothes, you have more material moving up and down the anatomy of the character, so it's going to bog up and bag on certain parts, and that's where the more vertical creases are going to occur, versus where if it's really tight, the anatomy underneath the clothes might actually be stretching that material, and it's going to cause a lot more horizontal creases. As the clothes get thicker, there will be less creases because it's more resistant to folding in general. And around the waist, the creases will run horizontally and deeper because the human figure naturally tapers in that area. When you're drawing your creases in the X and Y shapes, they generally alternate when you're drawing them so that they don't get confused for any other pattern. And analyzing photo references generally helps to better understand the patterns and repetition of the creases if you need help seeing this in action, or you're studying it. It generally helps to add the seams while drawing to add detail for creases later, so things like the shoulder seams on sleeves or pants seam are also really good bases for creases and folds as well. Keep in mind when the figure is in action, style is applied to the creases as well, which are going to create more straight creases because it implies more movement within the fold as well. If not, draw rounded creases because the figure is pushed into itself and there's less room for the material to stretch outwards from the anatomy that's underneath it. And some more small tips with pants: creases are generally formed around the hip joint and the knees. Again, the joints are where you want to focus on. And you generally want to draw smaller creases for the knees since the hips are going to have bigger creases, again with the natural taping of the figure. So remember that as clothes get thicker, there'll be less creases. This will also imply that there's less work to do between lines, and you can actually omit some as well. So this is just an extension of the past statement. And then the rest of this class was really just a visual demonstration from Chyan in the background, showing how he draws creases and hair. Really cool stuff. So if you're following along in the Coloso class, I'd recommend you just watch through it, especially for the creases. It'll make it a lot easier to visualize and see and understand those X and Y patterns. So as a quick summary to everything, understand the rules to guide by with hair and clothing. Style can be applied on a per case basis to each character's clothing and hair, so keep that in mind. And remember, those case circumstances depend on the impression that you want of your character as well as the context that they are in. And then finally, the hair strands and creases will change in appearance due to perspective, so draw them accordingly to the figure in question. Remember, if you're doing things like foreshortening and perspective, or if you're drawing in things like a 4 or 5 point perspective, for example, that the folds will naturally show perspective along with the figure, so keep that in mind. And then the self-assigned homework: draw 2 to 3 portraits of different characters with hairstyles, and then 2 to 3 figures as clothing at various angles and perspectives. So you can honestly just draw 2 or 3 figures and then just use them to practice your hairstyles and clothing, as well as practicing your figure drawing and perspective as well. And that way you can kind of get a practice on everything, which would be a really good condensed homework to take on. So that was section 2.4. Honestly, really exciting stuff moving ahead. The next class is going to be a bonus class, so it's not really going to pertain to any specific section, but it is going to be over human body drawing. So if you're still struggling with anatomy, this might be something to tune into for next time. But otherwise, we're going to be starting into the next section after that. So really exciting stuff to look forward to. Remember, you can always get updates to when things like that are coming out in the future, as well as any other content of mine on my socials. I'll show them around the screen here for you to check out if that's something you're interested in. But otherwise, thank you for joining me in today, and hopefully I will be seeing you in the next lecture review as well. Hope you guys have a good day. Remember to take it easy. Bye-bye.